Hello, folks. Hello, folks. It is about that time. People could take their seats and we can get ready for the thrilling discussion we're going to have today about the IASA. I have a couple of blue sheets here that I would like to start circulating. Please do sign them. What you see before you is a note well. While I sincerely hope that no protocol design or technology discussions will break out in the course of this particular meeting, nonetheless, do note it well. This is kind of what we're thinking we'd like to do today. We're going to have the intro that I'm doing right now. Oh, do you need a pen? Is there not a pen? It's a pencil. there must be another pen here. If someone can donate a pen, I heard there was a pen shortage actually. That'd be great. So this is roughly what we're thinking about doing. We're going to go through a report on the two workshops that transpired on February 28th that Joe Hall will lead. Olaf is going to provide us with a bit of insight into ISOC and ISOC's contributions to the IETF. Yari will then provide some of his reflections based on the years of hardship he has endured as IETF chair. And finally, then we will go to a discussion, which Alyssa will help us to kick off. And we can close the meeting at the end of the slot or before if we've resolved everything and are ready to go. But first, could I get a couple volunteers? I did put something on the list. I didn't get a lot of takers for that. For note takers and Jabber scribes, I see Martin in the back is happy to take some notes. Anyone else? If this is something I know we'd love to have a record of. Anyone willing to do the Jabber part? Okay. Oh, Dan. Thank you, Dan. Perfect. Okay. If anyone else feels like taking notes and sending them on to me after the fact, that would be appreciated. But anything to bash here? Anything we should be doing differently than what you see on the slides? If not, I will ask Mr. Hall to come forward, and I will get him set up here.
Hello, hello.
Get you up here.
Whoa. Okay, yeah. I will eat it. Okay. Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Thanks for being here. I'm happy to be here. What we're going to do right now is talk a little bit about the community feedback from the IETF community received during the two virtual workshops that IETF leadership put together.
Whoa.
It's doing that automatic.
Yeah, it's doing that automatic thing. That's not good.
Anyway, is that because it's in full screen and not presentation mode?
Maybe that's an, what should I do?
I think it's view. There we go. Cool.
Sorry.
All right. Let's see. So Gene Mahoney and I drafted the workshop report. Feel free to let us know if you see any inaccuracies in the remainder. Otherwise, that'll be the record. I'm here to talk about exactly what we did. Next slide. So just a quick outline. We'll talk about terminology and organizational structure. This stuff may be old hat to some of you, but we thought it'd be good to go over really quick. And then we'll talk about the issues raised at the virtual workshop. I want to make this very explicit that the order of these issues were not the same order as presented in the workshop. And Jean and I tried our best to figure out which seemed more important to folks at the workshop. So this is our reflection of what seems more important. So structural and organizational issues are the most important thing, going down to things that are less urgent and important. Next slide. So terminology is very important. Lots of acronyms. You guys are used to acronyms, but in this case we have 4 very specific ones that you'll need to be familiar with that I'll be using. IASA, which is the umbrella term for the IETF Administrative Support Activity. IAOC, which is the committee that oversees IETF, the IETF Administrative Oversight Function. And IAD, which is the sole staff member responsible for carrying out the work of IASA. This is an ISOC employee. And then the IETF Trust, which maintains intellectual property and other kinds of legal stuff in lieu of having an IETF legal entity itself. Next slide. This is the glorious organizational structure slide, I believe, that Alyssa put together. Feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. That describes sort of the various pieces of IASA at a somewhat level of detail. I'm not going to go into this, but it's helpful to have this. We'll put this up here during the discussion for reference. But anyway, next slide. Okay, so the first set of issues are around the structure and organization of IASA. The workshop chairs coming into this set of virtual workshops identified some things that they wanted to sort of seed the conversation with. And so, for example, there's not a real clear-cut line between the IETF and ISOC in terms of various issues, various types of functions and activities. The respective roles, especially in terms of representations made to sponsorships and external entities of ISOC, the IETF chair, and the IAOC are not clear either. Having the ISOC represent the IETF does create some confusion, and people will say, well, why am I writing a check to one and rather than the other? And there's a variety of other things about, so who can solicit sponsorships and donations? Well, it's not the IETF, it is often ISOC staff and people, volunteers on their own from the IETF community. Next slide. Okay, so not a lot of words on this slide, but I'm actually going to use my notes here to sort of get into some of the issues. In terms of things that were raised at the workshop relevant to structure and organization, there was some discussion about the delineation of roles and branding here. One participant said they can often be hard to figure out who is doing what on behalf of whom. That branding, using the term IETF or using the term ISOC, it's not a useful way to sort of figure out who's controlling or guiding some of that stuff. So, for example, the IETF journal, which has IETF in the name of it, is ISOC driven and funded. The technical fellows is an ISOC funded and controlled thing. That latter one definitely, workshop participants said that definitely seems like an ISOC activity, whereas the IETF journal seems not so much. Maybe that should be on the IETF side. Olaf, by the way, will have a really neat presentation in a bit about ISOC support for IETF activities. Participants here asked other questions like, who defines the contents of ISOC activities that are visible to the outside world that are branded IETF things? Who decides how to drive those things? Should those be included in IETF's budget? Which leads to another set of things around control and policy authority. One workshop participant said that the IETF community is often confused as to who has control over specific functions and specific parts of the, what part of IASA has policy authority in some areas. So for example, if the community wants to change some aspect of the current relationship with sponsors, it's unclear who can do that. Is that IAOC? Is that IESG, ISOC, IAD? It seems clearer to some people at the workshop than others, I should say, but many people said it, felt it was unclear. Another useful question is, for example, how does the IEOC get its policy instructions from the IETF community? Often the IEOC goes to the community for very specific, often very legal feedback. The privacy policy, or changes to the trust legal provisions, I think, are good examples. But it doesn't solicit sort of, please do this or please make this priority make this a priority. That kind of input is not there. Although there was a countering view expressed where someone said, doesn't this sort of policy authority from the IETF community, doesn't that come to the IAOC through the IESG via the IETF chair? And so there's even a lack of clarity to sort of what specific questions should be asked within the IASA structure. Someone raised, how many logos do we want on our badges? It's somewhat trivial, kind of a, maybe not trivial, but lower priority kind of consideration, or even just a more general, who has responsibility for whatever function. And finally, another, in the Control and Policy Authority, another commenter summarized this in the difference between a thin and thick IAOC, that is a thin IAOC that simply oversees the work of the IAD, or one that has more extensive sort of administrative responsibilities. It's meant to do many more things. In terms of the accounting structure here, participants commented that there has been increased clarity over the recent sort of 5 to 6 years about accounting for ISOC staff contributions to IETF activities. But this could be further improved, it sounds. But this also sort of raises control issues associated with accounting. For example, if there is something attributed to the IETF budget provided by ISOC that we don't like, can we delete it? Of course, the we here can be very different things if it's the IETF community or some element of the IASA that's conducting oversight like the IAOC. Another participant said that the control needs to be aligned with accounting, presumably making sure that IETF has control over things that are sort of attributed to its budget and can sort of say what happens with that stuff. Finally, there was some discussion about the benefits of a lack of rigid formality, and what we mean there is, there's some flexibility in the IASA structure, and IETF not being well-defined or even a legal entity, that itself might actually be a good thing for the internet. And by making it more rigid, that might backfire or at least reduce participation from those that like more or less rigid definition. Next slide. Okay, so in the funding issues area, there were some things raised by the workshop organizers. For example, meeting fees are a big part of the current revenue, an important source, I shouldn't say a big part, an important source of current revenue. But unfortunately, there's declining in-person attendance, which means meeting fees are going to be less abundant in the future. And sponsor support, there's some issues there. Getting support for the full sponsorship program doesn't appear to be easy. It's not clear when they're sponsoring one thing or another what the value proposition is there. And then since we tap the same funders for things that may look similar but are actually very distinct, there could be some exhaustion there. There's some comment, or they said the workshop organizers talked about meeting-based revenue seems sort of at odds with the bulk of the work done elsewhere, and that the IETF itself and IASA is increasingly relying on professional services, which tends to make expenses grow rather than relying on volunteer stuff. Okay, next slide. All right, in terms of funding issues, another one. Please check out Yari's draft on finances. I think all Leslie's draft, Yari's 2 drafts, those are really good background reading in all of this. So there was some initial discussion by workshop participants about the willingness to fund IETF at all. That may be a useful measure of IETF's relevance. So, for example, if sponsorship starts to dry up, is that a symptom of a larger problem? People aren't sort of coming hand over fist, how can we give you money to do good things? It seems clear that having multiple sources of funding is really important. The Global Hosts Program, which I believe is a $100K a year for 10-year kind of a commitment, that's more medium and longer term stability. The longer term, especially in how we count in terms of internet years. But that it's kind of hard to communicate to folks that the diversity of funding is just as important as the individual things you're funding itself. We need to think of a way of talking about that. Is the current mix of support optimal? Are there better ways of structuring those sort of funding streams to make the IETF more sustainable? Some other questions raised here were things like, what's the right proportion for meeting-based revenue? What are alternative methods to fund non-meeting-based activities? Are those sponsorships? Do we hire staff or contract more to provide assistance there? ISOC currently makes up annual IETF budget gaps, but not everyone seems to agree that ISOC's primary purpose is to fund the IETF. People had mentioned specifically, like if you're in a local ISOC chapter, you may not know a whole lot about the IETF, and you may think very different things about ISOC's primary purposes. There are other models out there in terms of funding work similar to what we do at the IETF. For example, open source projects can typically land $500,000 a year sponsorships. What might IETF need to look like to attract or support those kinds of donations? And meeting sponsorship, of course, is much more complicated than simply finding the funds to do something. You have to print T-shirts, you have to organize a social event. It would be, workshop participants mentioned, it would be far easier if you could just throw money at it and people could deal with the logistics of that other stuff. Funding outreach is a little unclear in terms of who is doing what. It seems to be various elements of IASA are involved in this. IETF chair in some parts, ISOC staff in large parts. OAuth will tell us a little bit more about that. But how does the IETF community or IAOC give input or shape this kind of outreach? That doesn't seem clear. How are new sponsors identified and recruited so we're not sort of banging away at the same folks over and over again? And then finally, another participant offered the perspective as a large organizational sponsor. Writing checks to ISOC instead of IETF can pose internal problems, both, for example, in terms of the initial approval of the funds and where you're writing the check to, but also in terms of auditing the use of the funds later. They're like, okay, you are sponsoring this, but you're writing checks to this. What's going on there? It's sort of unclear how and when the money eventually makes it to IETF, to the sponsors who are writing very big checks. A participant felt maybe that shouldn't be the case, and that this seems especially acute with the IETF endowment, as there's no independent organization managing and reporting on the status or use of those funds. Next slide. Cool. And in terms of transparency communication issues, again, the workshop organizers came with some stuff to see the conversation. That IAOC has typically operated very differently in terms of transparency than other kinds of IETF activities. That there's some roots of that lack of transparency in terms of confidentiality of certain kinds of things, pricing and contracts, personnel issues, which is sensitive kinds of information. And that it doesn't seem that there are really clear requirements from the community about transparency of the IAOC activity, IAOC committee. Next slide. So here, workshop participants talked about things like there could be more communication between IAOC and IASA with the IETF community. I know you're all saying, wait a sec, didn't we just cut the plenary time and things like that? And I think this was summed up well down at the bottom, which is, boring details, which are boring until they're not, and then everyone's surprised and wants to be active right then and there. But should the IETF community actually document this transparency commitment? Should it be more like the IESG, where it's a default open policy, and you publish an exception list for sensitive matters? And are what's driving the lack of transparency outside of confidentiality or sensitivity matters? I cheekily should have removed this. Sorry, put this FOMO thing. FOMO, fear of missing out. FOMO, fear of not missing out. Essentially, community backlash. You may just not want to have to deal with 5,000 people coming to you all the time. And then there could be, legitimate concerns. The other one wasn't legitimate, but about rehashing very complicated conversations over and over again once someone has, once an IASA body has made a decision. And then, there's this desire to sort of balance this impatience with administrivia and desires to provide input. And it may be appropriate, rather than knowing what IAOC actually has just done, getting regular updates about what it's going to do. Next slide. Okay. Right on. Okay, so again, this is staff and volunteer resource issues. The workshop chairs seeded the conversation with this material, basically saying, it's clear that the work of the IAD is much more than a full-time job. There's a lot of staff that support that role, but we only have one person allocated to it. Should that look a little different? And then, the things that are sort of required to be able to do this function are different than they were 10 years ago. There's a whole bunch of political and social and health issues, visa issues, demanding passwords at borders issues. Anyway, and it turns out that, IETF community members aren't sort of primed to be really interested in supporting administrative stuff. And so we want to be able to attract them in a way that gets them included. Okay, next slide. Okay, so in the virtual workshop, participants came forward with a bunch of different points here. And so, the IASA function is supported by a ton of committees. And do we understand the scope of those committees, how people are chosen, and the kinds of expertise are useful for those committees? On some level, we need to define the roles of, as people said, throughout all this, I'm not speaking, I'm channeling the voices of the workshop participants. Can we define the roles of individuals, how they're chosen, what roles are better done by paid contractors? And right now that org chart we showed you earlier seems to have evolved in an organically complex way over the past 10 years, but not in a way that is necessarily directed, although it seems to support the work. Next slide. Okay, this is the last two slides, I believe. So the last one on internal IAOC organizational issues. So this is definitely lower down in what we thought was perceived priority in writing this up. There's this really strained membership model of the IAOC where, after there's people that are sort of organizationally constrained in the amount of stuff they can do that are the ex officio members. You have 4 others, then you have to pick 2 chairs, the IAOC chair and the IETF trust chair from that, which means you have 2 people left that aren't, chairs of something, are really busy to actually do the work. Now, there's this interesting discussion about the IAOC and the IETF trust having a significant amount of overlap, and that may sort of convenient in the past is that you sort of shot 2 birds with 1 stone. I don't know if you shoot stones, whatever. That's not as, and Yari commented that during the IANA transition, it was clear that wasn't as useful as it had been in the past and kind of complicated things. And then having the IAB chair serve on the IEOC overloads the IAB chair's responsibilities, and the same may be true for the IETF chair. Next slide. That's the last slide. Sorry, I'm at like maybe 1 acre. Okay, so workshop participants raised a bunch of issues here about internal IAOC stuff. It's clear that we need to revisit the workshop participants said it's clear we need to revisit how we populate the IAOC. It seems pretty clear that it needs to be bigger in some fashion or less constrained in some fashion. And volunteers for this work may not exactly work out. Although at the same time, if you're having paid staff, who presumably have an employment relationship with other people on the committee, you want to do that carefully as well. And again, re-emphasizing the issue that, if you want to have a thin or a thick IAOC, those look like different things. And this whole convenience that the trust and the IAOC are heavily overlapping seems to no longer be the case. I think that's it.
All right, thank you, Joe. Next, we're going to have Olaf come up, and while I sit up here, let me just remind folks, we do have plenty of time for discussion after this, so clarifying questions only, and I know we're all extremely skilled at camouflaging our views, clarifying questions, but really, please, discussion after we're done with the next 2 presentations. Thank you.
So I need to stand in the box, huh?
Ideally, stand in the box, Olaf, if you can, thanks.
So the context for this is trying to give you a little bit of a feel of what ISOC does in the context of IETF work. Is it all autoplay? Yeah.
No, I said it myself.
So I think we're on a journey here as ISOC as well. Since last year, we identified IETF as a specific strategic objective within our activity plan. We didn't do that before. Normally, IETF was across the organization part of the work or part of the input or output of our work. Now we have identified what we're doing in the context of IETF and put that in a strategic objective. And that makes it a little bit easier for me to present here how we split that up. So what I'm going to show you here is our 2017 budget. Those are guesstimates. And specifically in terms of FTEs that I'm going to show, I think that those guesstimates are a little bit on the low side, but they will give you an idea of what we do. First, ISOC's contribution. There is a direct financial contribution to the IETF. The budget for that is 2.3 million in 2017. And there's also a commitment to, if there's shortfall on the actuals, to put that extra cash in. That happened last year, for instance, with the Buenos Aires meeting, which cost less income, less revenue on the IETF budget, and so that is filled in by ISOC. So that's the monetary part, and there is a little bit of an interaction between the monetary part and the work that ISOC does in the context of the IETF. Essentially, we have two big initiatives within that in the objective, and that's the IETF financial sustainability, and then something that we call promote the diverse participation in the IETF. So that's outreach to new participants, bridging communities, and so on and so forth. Next slide. So in the financial sustainabilities, two projects, the normal sponsorship and the endowment. The normal sponsorship is basically making sure that there is sponsorship around, that there is outreach. It's 2.3 million per year for the meetings, and additional sponsorship needs for special occasions, like what do we do long term with remote participation. Roughly 1.45 FTEs, or 1.5 FTE staff support. But also note, and this is, I think, important for sort of the clarity, that in 2017, we expense some of those staff support back to the IETF. So if you look at the IOC budget, you will see a number there, and that's on the last slide, on slide 10, which is basically expensing staff support back to the IETF. And I think that if you talk about what is under control of the IETF and what do we guide, I think that provides a little bit of clarity. Next slide.
Quick clarifying question from that slide and the slide before. Can you go back one slide?
Yeah, go back.
2.3 million in 2017, now go forwards, 2.3 million sponsorship. Are those the same numbers or are those different numbers?
Different. Yeah. They happen to be the same number, but they're different pieces. They're different bills.
Does that mean it comes to, I'm sorry? Thank you,
Yeah,
very good. So what she said was 4.6 total, thank you.
Correct. Yeah. IETF endowment is another way to create financial stability for the IETF in the long term. There's a bunch of fundraising goals. We have budget to support this effort, but we feel that the IETF is leading this effort. We're working with the IETF on the endowment, but that is a constant interaction, and so it's budgeted for the amount of activity that will take this year is under consideration. Next slide. So this is the second project. This is more about community diversification and participation. For us, this project is partly bringing people towards the IETF, but also using the IETF as a tool that helps people understand that the plumbing is important. So it is both an outreach mechanism as well as an awareness mechanism. It serves two purposes. And with these things, in individual projects, we try to, of course, work with the community to to fine-tune whatever we're doing. But these are projects that we have established in the hope that we help. Technical fellowship is one. We bring fellows from across the world, young students, talents to the IETF to get them involved in the work, and also bring back knowledge about the IETF to the communities. The policy fellows, while that doesn't bring new participants really into the IETF, they are a way to get political credibility for the IETF in the broad community. It is a way to educate policymakers and to raise awareness about how the pie is made. And our experience is that those policymakers return and say, nothing to see here, let's move on. IETF Journal, a mechanism to show what is going on in the IETF, what is the pulse of the IETF. It's for participants as well as external people that have an interest in the IETF. And then we have a bunch of bridging activities. The Applied Network Research Prize is an attempt to bridge the academic community with work that is going on in the IETF. The ACM SIGCOM workshop that's happening falls also in this bucket. And further, we have staff that helps with, for instance, the education and mentoring program. Okay, you saw Karen sitting here when you walked in. So next slide. The budget envelope of that, I think it's a little bit of an underestimate, 1.5 FTE. The expenses here are real. We fly people in, we pay their IETF attendance fee. So those are, that's roughly $500,000. That's real money. Next one. Regional diversification. So this is where in the regions we use the IETF as a mechanism to make people interested in the plumbing of the internet. And for us, it's a mechanism to get first people involved in the IETF, young engineers, young talents. Again, talents are everywhere in the world. We think they should be involved with the IETF if they have something to bring. But also the IETF might be an inspirational factor for them to continue work in network engineering. So we have outreach activities in the Asian Pacific, the African, the Russian, the Latin American region, and some general work. And what this is about is IETF awareness meetings, work with the local community to do remote attendance, bridging of reporting about the IETF in NOCs and NRENs and that type of work. So for us, a strategic way to engage talents in network operations in the internet. Next slide. Budget for that, 0.6 FTE support. That is a gross underestimate, by the way. I should talk to our people, that's not real. And 152K of expenses. Next slide. When you walk around here, you will see us do many other things that are not part of the IETF strategic objective. It's things that we do. John Pastel Award, support of the ombudsperson. The CEO is part of the IESA. I myself walk around here. We have liaison functions. Staff that is working on technical issues, you will find working here in the IETF, like again, Karen chairing the TikTok and the NTP working group. Those type of things are pieces of our other strategic activities in which we work in the IETF to achieve them. Another example, again, Karen, is the NDSS IETF related workshops. We had 2 workshops now where we bridge the academic community, security community in the NDSS with work that is going on in the IETF, the Tron workshop and the DNS privacy workshop this year. Those are things that you don't see with numbers, but they're part of our work and where we come with the IETF. So last slide. I already said there is a number of activities that have to do with supporting the IETF that end up in the expense line of the IAOC budget. And these are them. It's accounting admin support, it's sponsorship support, a rent and office support, which is, by the way, 0, and communication support. So this is, for instance, Greg Wood's activities are an expense item in the budget. Obviously, that is a, as we say in Dutch, a vestzak exercise, vest pocket, pants pocket. If that number gets higher, the amount of surplus or negative surplus gets higher as well. And I saw chiefs. So that was it.
Thank you, Olaf. So no further clarifying questions, Jari?
Yes, so I actually feel a little bit funny talking here about these issues because Joe already went through, in a very extensive fashion, much of the feedback that we've been collecting, and my feedback was there as well. But maybe there's some value in me doing this because I'm picking up just a few items, and those are the items that are high up on my mind, at least, on things that we need to pay attention to. So maybe that view is helpful. If you go to the next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about two things, finance and then IASA operations or organization in general. So if we look at the finance piece, I think we can say that we have a strong support base for our income at the IETF. We got the host, global hosts, ISOC, IETF endowment. Those are all, I would claim, in very stable ground. But the IETF budget actually goes beyond this. So our budget is based on the assumption that we will get those and some additional sponsorship money, and that has been a little bit harder to get based on experience at least. And then in addition, we have a situation where the community size is relatively stable. It's not growing, it's not shrinking, or it might shrink if you look at the people who are shrinking a little bit as far as attendees in a physical meeting go, but we also have remote attendees. So we have a sort of flat user base. We have a rising cost trend that has nothing to do with the IETF. Like hotel arrangements cost more every year. We also have an increasing use of professional services by the IETF. And one example of this is that our community develops tools and they ultimately go into sort of a commercial professional service and are rewritten or maintained. My statistics tools that I've been maintaining, or not really maintaining the last couple of years, but I originally wrote them, they're being replaced by a commercially produced service in the near future, just one example of that. And then, of course, as mentioned, the people who are joining our meetings and other proceedings in a virtual fashion, the technology that we are making ourselves is helping us, stay back home and just participate virtually, which does affect our bottom line because we also run on the meeting costs. So if you take all of these factors together, you have a situation where it's not dire, but you actually have to do something. We can't keep on doing this forever on this track. There's also sponsor experience issues that we should talk about. The experience could be improved. In many cases, you have a situation where companies, for instance, are quite keen on the technology that we do, but yet if you go and ask if they can sponsor us, it's a little bit harder to explain, why would they sponsor. So having clarity there is important. As you know, the IETF community occasionally is also quite clear on, if something goes wrong during a meeting or sponsorship arrangements. The sponsor will hear about this, and that's a factor that people actually consider when they make sponsorship decisions. And finally, we also have had issues in thinking about who we actually target with sponsorship requests. In some cases, we've gone sort of far out into some location in the world and tried to get support from that area. Whereas, for our other meetings, we just, get one of the global hosts to support us, as an example. And I think we have to change this. This is more a global business situation. It's availability of sponsorship funds should be more carefully considered. Next slide. Then other topics. I think there's a structural issue here that we have to fix. The system has grown tremendously since it was set up 10 plus years ago. I think we have a system that's basically designed for, like one person, one IAD, and that can handle everything. Now we actually have lots of people working around that system, and the organization isn't as optimal for that as it could be. We also have bundling the IAOC with IETF Trust, which I sort of have grown to, or I used to think that's a good thing, but now I think they are actually quite separate tasks. And we could easily unbundle them and make some busy people less busy by distributing the load further. As has been discussed, the clarity of IETF ISOC interface is something that could be improved. I'll also note that if you poll people, would you like to work on this and this role within the administrative pieces of IETF, you don't get a lot of, you get some volunteers, but not a huge amount. Sometimes we have only one person to sign up for non-com slot, for instance, and so forth. So that's a problem. To me, that says more of this probably needs to be sort of outsourced or done by professionals, and not so much of it by us. There's also issues around our meeting planning process that I'm sure everybody has observed. But there's also opportunities there. For instance, we do use repeats. So most or many of our meetings are back to the same hotel that we've been to before, or at least back to the same city. But that isn't entirely taken into account in the process that we go through when doing this. So I think we could actually handle that a little bit smoother. So those were the issues that I had high up on my mind. And any questions I can answer? Otherwise, I'll turn it over to further discussion.
And to tee up the discussion, thank you, Jari. Alyssa will come up and say a couple of words. Let me get my slides back up here. I think we're going to have this be the backdrop of the discussion. Is it doing the slide thing? Oh, well, it's fine. This, yeah, that's good.
Thanks. Yeah, I think so. Where this came from actually is that the IAD Ray has a couple of charts that are much more elaborate than this, which he uses to kind of keep track of all of the different functions that are supposed to be encompassed in IASA. And they were so complicated because the structure that we have is quite large and complicated, that I tried to sort of distill this down into something that would actually fit on one slide, and that people could actually sort of understand. So there's a few things that could have been included here and would still be understandable that are missing. So I just wanted to give a little more color on this. First of all, there should also be arrows between the IAD and all of the committees, because the IAD sits on all of the IOC's subcommittees. And second of all, you see the arrows around managing contracts. That actually represents a couple of dozen contracts at any one time that are being managed. So, and there's lots of other detail that is missing here, but the point of this is to sort of point out just how the complexity and the size of the administrative activity of the IETF has grown, and give a sense of what it looks like right now. So from my perspective, I think the workshops that we had were really excellent in terms of distilling out a lot of the issues. Thank you, Joe, for reviewing that with us, and we definitely want to finish up that workshop report, so appreciate comments on the report. At this point, I feel like we have a few things that we can do, and I just want to share some framing thoughts so that we can discuss. The first is that we had Jari come and talk about the funding. The other presentations were a little bit more around the administrative side and the programming side of the IETF. And to me, those two streams are related, but we can kind of consider them a little bit separately. In my mind, at least, that's how it shakes out. So those streams of thought need to be talking to each other. But as we go forward and try to think about, okay, we've identified a bunch of problems. Now, what are we going to do about them? We might want to consider the funding issues a little bit separate from the administrative issues. So that's just point one about how do we organize our thoughts today and going forward. But the other thing I think we need to do, we've identified a lot of problems, as Joe and Yari articulated, and I think we need to kind of distill out like what is the essence of those problems, and as a means to figure out what are we really trying to solve here. And I'll just sort of paraphrase something that I put out on the list last week, which is that to me, I think there's really kind of two pressing issues that color everything else that we're talking about here. The first one is that, as this diagram shows, the personnel structure that we have for administering the IETF, and I'm just focusing on the admin portion now, sort of putting the funding aside. The personnel structure that we have for administering the IETF is basically outmatched by the size and complexity of the task. It has changed a lot over time, even just since IESA was established 12 years ago. And it's not limited to there not being enough people, including both volunteers and staff. That's part of it. We always have trouble finding more volunteers. We have way more work than there are people to do that work right now. But it's also about sort of the shape of this, the way that much of it is centralized around the IAD. And also the way that the lines of responsibility are separated vis-a-vis other concepts that are important to who's on which side of those lines. So we've had some discussion on the list about how many ISOC staff are actually involved in supporting what the IAD does. Olaf talked a little bit about how many ISOC staff approximately are involved in various other parts of ISOC's programming. Those things all matter a lot to the IETF. In some cases, the IOC has sort of indirect oversight over those things because it has oversight over the IAD. But in reality, we don't have a lot of oversight over things like those people's performance reviews, what skills they bring to the table, who gets hired, what the retention is like of many, many, many of the staff who are indirectly supporting the IETF. So it's part of it is about, just how many warm bodies do we have, but part of it is really about how this thing is actually structured. So that's, I think, one kind of key takeaway for me is that the personnel structure that we have doesn't really match the tasks right now. The other one that kind of came up again and again in the workshops was this notion about lack of clarity over who has authority over decisions and budgets. And we saw that within the IOC context, but also within the broader IASA context vis-a-vis other decisions that are getting made. So to me, that's the other really strong theme, that if at the end of this process we haven't achieved that clarity, then we probably say that we have failed. So what I'd love for at the end of this session today is to have, first of all, some feedback is those are what I think are the two big problems. I'd love to know, what do other people think? Does that seem right? Is that off course? Are there other really big problems or ways of distilling all of the problems that we've talked about into something that we can reasonably try to conceptualize to solve, which I don't think we're quite at that point yet. So I'd love to understand that. But I'd also like to understand a little bit how the community feels about the direction in which we should go in terms of thinking about the solution space. And again, here, I feel like we have a little bit of a choice. So there's one way to look at this where you look at the structure that we have, you look at BCP 101, and you say, okay, we have non-common appointed IOC, we have the IAD, we have these contractors, and there's a bunch of fixes that we could make to improve upon a lot of the things that we're talking about, but we can make those fixes within the same basic structure that we have right now. So that's kind of one approach. There's another potential approach to this, which says maybe we should consider changes to the structure that we have. So, and that could be, anything on the table, but anything that involves, considering different relationships between all of the entities, a different relationship between ISOC and the IETF, or between the IEOC and the community, or between any of the parties. And as I try to conceptualize, like, what are we going to do next, or what are we going to do with this big pile of problems, I think it would be really helpful to understand from the community kind of which of those directions people are leaning more towards or feeling more comfortable with. So, do people want to consider more significant structural kinds of changes, or do we want to consider making changes within our existing structure? So that's kind of the other big question that I at least would be interested in hearing from people about. And that is all I have. So I leave it to you to shepherd the discussion here.
Thank you, Alyssa. I'm shocked we don't already have a microphone line here. But yes, please do come to the mic and let's ask that. This is a brainstorming session. We don't have a BOF charter here. We're not forming a working group. So this is really just an opportunity for the community to talk about the issues that Alyssa's raised and that we saw from the workshops and try to get some clarity.
Lou Berger, clarifying question to Alyssa. Unless I missed it, I didn't hear the word trust. So where does that fit in?
Yeah, no. So obviously the trust is implicated by all of this, and Joe talked about it at length. It's not on this slide because you can only fit so much on one slide. But yeah, of course the trust is implicated by this, and there's a bunch of stuff in the problem in the workshop report about the trust.
Andrew? Yeah. Or Lou, yes.
So the main point I was trying to bring up is that should be part of the discussion as well.
Yeah, totally is.
Thanks.
My name is Andrew Sullivan. So just on the question that Alyssa just posed about, do we make sort of tiny changes, assuming the basic structure that we've got, or do we tackle this thing in a bigger way? Since I'm no longer a part of any of this, I can say without any hesitation that my experience over the past 2 years suggests to me that the structure is too weak. It needs very, very significant changes, and that's partly because it overloads a number of positions in a way that probably shouldn't be. And there was a point in the past when I understand why people did it that way, but I think it was a big mistake. So when I made this argument to somebody who was involved, I guess, in the original design of this, the person in question said to me, no, it has to be the IAB chair because you're the only person who has all the state of everything, and you got to like run it all through that. And my reaction to this, of course, was if somebody came into your working group and said, here in the middle is a magic box that everything goes through and it holds all the state, you would throw them out. So like we should not design our own systems that way either. And I think that is one of the really, really deep weaknesses in this system. There's too much overloading of people. I think that we should tackle that problem.
Ted Hardy, first I remind my colleague that his red dot does not expire until Friday, so he's still implicated for a few more hours. We're going to miss him. Secondly, I think that there are a couple of different ways to look at how you want to tackle the problem, and I agree that the structures that we have right now may be strained in a variety of ways. Certainly the amount of work may be much more than was originally anticipated, and that focusing it on a single individual doing a bunch of this stuff is probably certainly a risk, if not just to the health of the individual involved, but to him winning the lottery and wandering away. But the question I actually want to ask is kind of related to the magic box question. If we were designing this as a set of APIs and not worrying about how much effort it takes to produce the information across these APIs, would this in fact be the right set of connections? And I think that it is not in fact the right set of connections, and that What that means is you can't fix this problem by putting more resources in the current set of boxes, because that just means that there are more people or contracts or whatever to pass the data across the wrong API. And I think the problem we actually have here is because all of our data is currently passing through these APIs, it's colored by the shape of the API in ways that we can't easily reconfigure. And I think that means that the process, although I think it does mean we need to do more than a simple refactoring into an actual restructuring, is going to be quite significant. And I want to be very clear that, speaking as a member of the community, that I would like to see that, but I understand that it is going to be a heck of a lot of work, not just to Alyssa and the other members of that team, but for all of us, because actually trying to gather the data of what new APIs would look like on this sort of thing is neither our forte nor our primary work.
Harold?
Harald Alvestrom. Oh, this mic is good. I like hearing my own voice. 2 points. One is the trust. The structure of the trust was thrust upon us by a sudden demand from certain quarters, named unknown, which could be most easily satisfied by giving another label to ISOC, to the IOC. We should regard redesigning the appointment of trustees to the trust as a completely separable task, and probably an important task, but it's almost completely irrelevant to all the other problems facing the IOC. Now, having gotten that out of the way, the way I saw the IOC when we set it up was to make sure a few things did not happen. In some ways, it was designed to not work. As in, if you have to do work, you're doing it wrong. That was the idea. Of course, it didn't work out that way. People always work. Yeah, but we had to have someone to manage contracts. So we put in someone to manage contracts. We couldn't think of anything smaller than one person, so we put in one person. We had to have someone give orders to that person. And it was obvious that having the IETF community give orders is, well, I'll leave it at that. So we created a body of people who were giving orders to this person. And we wanted that body of people to be responsible to the IETF community, so we let the IETF community pick them. So the things we wanted not to happen included the ID wandering off on its own and doing things that didn't help the IETF. We didn't want the IOC to become a power center that would think of itself as the ruler of the IETF. So one of the points of putting all those chairs on there, putting chairs on chairs, and stacking things like that, was that there should be no question about this being a power center. This was a chore that we put on the chairs. So yes, we need this stuff to work, and we need it to work efficiently. But don't forget where we came from. We tried to do the absolute minimum in order to get it to work. And if there are tasks that don't need to be done, don't do them.
Jonas Oininen. So, Alyssa, you asked that should we consider kind of like small tweaks or kind of bigger overhaul of the system? And I was thinking about that question, and I thought that I don't think that's the right question. I think the question is actually, what do we want? What do we want to accomplish here? What is the target? And then look at what needs to be done to achieve that target. So if we look at the current structure that was done in, well, 12 years ago, with an IETF that we had 12 years ago. And our main target, we never wrote it down, but I think it was actually quite a bit discussed at that time, was that IETF would be in control of its own administrative fate, which it wasn't before that. That we could actually organize the meetings the way that we wanted. We would get the new technologies in the meetings. We would know what money comes in and what money goes out and so on. And that was the main target. And this was how the structure was created, was to reflect the IETF at that time. So it is quite minimalistic. It relied heavily on volunteers because that was how IETF worked at that well, and that was how IETF wanted to work at that time as well. So we used a lot of volunteers to do a lot of our kind of like coding and organizing things and stuff like that. So now that we are here 12 years later, we should think about, well, what does IETF look like now? What would be an organization that would fit the IETF better today? And it's not necessarily anymore the same kind of organization that we had at that time. We still rely heavily on volunteers, and that is still a good thing in a way. But the thing is that the volunteers might be doing different things. And there might be a different level of interest also for volunteering that time. So we should think that about, first of all, what is the target that what we want to achieve? And then the thing is, how has IETF changed over those years? Partly because how we engineered this at that time to reflect that the organization of what we had then. This has now overloaded the people that are on IAOC and who are around it, because these things had to be done that were done by volunteers or that were done on an ad hoc basis. Now they have to be done more professionally, and those people are now overloaded. So thinking about how to what is the target maybe that we want to professionalize or kind of like make this look like more that IETF is and the reality is today.
Oh, what do you think the target should be?
Oh, that is a good question. And I wasn't expecting that. That's bad. The thing is, of course, I'm like, one of the things is target is just to review, is the structure any more kind of like helpful, or does it fit the organization that we have today? I think partly the workshops that have been organized, most probably not completely at least. The other thing is that looking at the BCP 101 and looking at some of the things there is like, some of the things that were there were done in the design of that time. So looking at that, does that still fit? The other target, those are not very good targets, I have to admit. But the thing is basically, I don't know. I really don't know what the target is. But
are you convinced that there is at least a situation that warrants?
Yeah, I think it warrants at least review.
Yeah.
I think that is, I'm like, it's 12 years and IETF looked very differently. And we had a target at that time, which doesn't exist anymore, which was just to get the faith in our own hands. We have that. We have had it for 12 years. Now it's time to review that. Does this fit the IETF?
I should say, do we actually still have it in our hands, given what the situation? I mean, I think that's what the workshop report, if anything, reflects, that there's at least some concerns about that.
Right.
So, Colin Jennings, I'm here really to represent Cisco and talk more about our role as a global sponsor. And normally Dave Ward represents us in these things, but he's not here today. I've removed my shoes to get in the right Ward mindset for the whole thing. And I'm sure he'd be saying the same thing right now if he's here, perhaps more eloquently. When we go and sponsor, we support both the ISOC and the IETF goals and missions, but quite differently, and we fund them internally with different budgets. We would like those to be very separable, and for us to be able to directly fund IETF with an understanding that, you know, how that money was spent was directly impacted by the community, the IETF community, and those sorts of decisions. That would make it much easier for us to explain how it was being used gather things internally, get the stuff to the right places to make it happen. So from that point of a global sponsor point of view, we really would prefer a significant change where there was, separate bank account, separate responsibility, probably separate mission statement, obviously still linked and connected together in the sense of, these two organizations work closely together, but we need two organizations. So that's the direction I'd like to see go.
Leslie?
Thanks, Leslie Daigle. I stood up in part because I suspect that I am the person in question that Andrew referred to. At any rate, I have said those things. Well, then, there you go. I have said those things. I have said that the reason that the IAB chair needs to be on the IOC is because they are the person who's plugged into all of the IAB activities, and more to the point, that the IAB chair and the IETF chair basically are two peas in a pod the way things work today. As an illustration of that, I recall vividly having a conversation where I started a comment with one of them in the hallway at one point in the day and finished it with the other of them in a different hallway at the end of the day. It's like, well, clearly the mind link was working, or you were talking, or something. But the point is, I think that it is a fact that today IETF chair and IAB chair are plugged into a lot of things. In this room, we can say, therefore, it is currently important to have those views represented on the IOC. But if you don't like that, I don't think that's an IOC problem to solve. I think that's an IAB and/or IESG problem to solve, that there's one person plugged into so many things. So set that off our table for today. The other thing I wanted to say, and apologies, I'll take a bit of time for context. I was certainly there when we set up the IASA, including, I earned the threat of a lawsuit out of this. And I was the first IAB chair on the IAOC and, helped hire our IAD, and was part of its functioning in the early years. After I stopped being IAB chair in 2007, I blissfully wandered off and did other things for a while, and then for some mad reason, volunteered to the NOMCOM to be appointed to the IOC again a couple of years ago. So I came back into this environment, with a multi-year gap in my IOC inbox. And the reason I drag you through all of that detail is just to say, so I've seen it in the beginning, I see it now. These are two very different beasts, right? The world is really different. If you look at that diagram, the number of things that were not on it in 2005 is long, right? We didn't have the RFC editor contract as part of this directly. We certainly were only beginning to have a secretariat contract, so on and so forth. And I think the important thing for this discussion is, I think we did a damn fine job of setting this thing up in 2005. Yay us. That doesn't in any way need to take away from taking out a blank piece of paper today and saying, what problem do we need to solve today? And I think that we do need to change some things fairly significantly, because in 2005, we had no idea about this whole raising money thing. We didn't even know how, we didn't have even a firm grasp on what our revenues were from meetings, costs versus revenues, et cetera. We had no experience in all of that, not our forte, somebody said earlier. We actually have collectively, with the staff that we have, the people that we work with our own experience in discussions like this, we have a lot more experience in those more mundane things now. We can restructure this so that we take more control of those more mundane things, and we shouldn't be afraid to, in my opinion.
Lucy?
So Lucy Lynch, the first IAOC chair. And I'm going to echo some of the things that Harald said, but also some of the things that Leslie said. I think what's important here is to get up a meta level above this and look at the whys of the design as it was originated and what the values behind those that we may still want. We still want to be mostly a volunteer organization, or at least I believe that. We still want independent relationship with whatever our funding sources and administrative core are around the IAD. I think some of those things have stayed valid. And the fact that everybody gets up here and says it's 10, 12 years and that we've run with this design, how many of you are in organizations that reorg every 6 months? I mean, this was a
Those are the stable ones.
Yeah, so this was an extremely constrained design by intent, and I think it has reached the edges of the protocol, and it's time for a redesign. But I think the design problems are still the same. So both the maintaining a volunteer core, maintaining independence, maintaining the idea of individual participants as opposed to staff and members, those things. It's very core to who we are. So keeping those in the design as you redesign, which I think you must.
Hi, Jason Livingood. Couple of comments. One, I'd like to echo, speaking as a global host from Comcast, Cullen's comments. I think it's far easier to have separation there. It's more understandable to the people that need to like write the big checks and get those things processed internally. It's very complicated to explain every single year to a constantly changing cast of finance and accounting people. So that's the first point. The second, certainly on the question of sort of incremental change versus a clean sheet redesign, I think I would echo certainly what Lucy said and Leslie hinted at as well. 12 years is a long time for any organization to go without a reorganization. I think it's a testament that the design was pretty good at the outset, that it's lasted this long. But, if this was an airplane, we're sort of at the outer limits of the design envelope. And, I don't want to see the wings fall off in the near future. So I think it makes sense to do a clean sheet redesign, which means step back from the existing structure and say, what are you trying to get done? What are the sort of administrative and other operational things you need to get done? And then eventually back into what the structure would be and how to organize that. But it seems like, time is ripe to do that now.
Thank you. Bob?
Hi, well, Bob hinted, this mic works much better than the other ones in the other rooms. This, just two thoughts. First of all, this chart reminds me of, you may have heard this, but, if you build, like when they build a university, they, and they have big open areas, they have a choice between, for the designers to lay out where the paths are, put the concrete down, or you just plant grass and you see where the paths are. That's what happened. And I think to Leslie's point, it's good. The structure we set up evolved to do what we think we're doing today. So I think that's been successful. I think and I agree that it's been a while and this is a good exercise, and I'm sure we can do it better. But I think as to what Lucy said, I think we need to think hard about the way what kind of organization we want to be. Do we want to be volunteer-based or paid staff-based? I personally think going to paid staff isn't a good idea because the paid staff will end up running the organization, and the community will have less and less say. And I think it will also make the finances even harder. You can look at what's happening in W3C. That's, they write their paid staff writes many of the documents. That's like the other side, but that's not, my understanding is they're having lots of organizational troubles these days. I don't think we want to go there. This community works differently, but those are, I think, the kind of things we need to be agreeing on before we get into how we're going to do it. And I think that covers a lot of things. Obviously you could I'm not proposing that you could hand a bunch of stuff to ISOC to do, and they'll do it. We may or may not like it. And that's the trade-off. When we set this thing up, there was a requirement that, we wanted to be self-governing. We wanted to not have someone else doing all this. And we got that, but whether we as a community want to put enough effort into doing it, has clearly been a challenge. We don't see a lot of volunteers here. We're very happy to complain when it doesn't go well, or I'll even use the word perfectly. But, we don't necessarily then go volunteer to help work on it. So that's a problem we have, and we're going to have to come to terms with.
Hi, Eric Priscola. So I looked at this diagram and I'm like, where's the PCSCF? I mean, this looks like the IMS diagram.
Might put your mic a little farther.
Sorry. Used to,
Yeah.
I guess one does kind of work.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Previously, I've been having to like do this. So, I mean, I, like Leslie, was there when this was designed. And so I'm quite familiar with the Constraint Center, which was designed. And I think it was a pretty reasonable design, you know, for that time and those constraints. And while the basic principles, I think, as Lucy said, haven't changed, the operating environment we find ourselves in has. And so this has now started to age, and you know, organizations age, and as Bob said, they sort of accrete stuff, and then eventually you refactor. And so it's a clear time for some kind of refactor. You know, I guess a few other points I was noticing as other people were talking. I don't think there's really much danger of the paid staff running everything. You know, I spent a lot of time watching what the Secretariat does, and they do a fantastic job of keeping everything running. And like, don't ask me to tell you where a meeting is or like book a room. So, but you know, I don't think there's really much danger that, of turning W3C structure. That the W3C has as its core the idea that the paid staff are part of the technical mix, and I think we do a pretty good job of having self-governance and having effective paid staff without sort of a structure of paying staff to develop the standards. I guess finally, you know, we don't give anywhere near as much money as Cisco or Comcast. We have given money, and it's really much easier for us to understand that we're giving money to IETF for specific things, as opposed to we're giving money to some global pot that somehow gets allocated in some unspecified way.
So I'm Kathy Brown. I am with the Internet Society, and for those of you who don't know, I actually sign everything, which I found extraordinary when I came on. I didn't understand that I signed everything, and that indeed I am legally responsible for everything. So and I want to make this point because I want to make a further point here. First, I think 3 observations that I thought would be helpful to you as you think this stuff through. One, I think that what came out of the roundtables was excellent, and I really appreciate that people were able to put on the table some of the frictions that are in the system right now that ought to get some attention. So that's number one. Number two, my observation is that many of those frictions are actually structural, or at least caused by structural issues, and they're not personal issues. They're not about persons. It's not about commitment. ISOC has deep commitment to IETF, deep commitment. Indeed, people feel that we are partners. Many people at the IETF, I think, who may have come in later don't actually understand, as I didn't, what the deep relationships are, and the fact that these relationships are part of what you see in this org chart. You know, these were the same people. You know, I often said, how does it come about that the president of ISOC appoints the NOMCOM chair? Just think about that.
Yeah, but in which direction?
But it clearly, once one understands that it was 8 people who, you know, figured out the whole, I mean, you know, this was an amazing thing, the birth of the internet. Okay, you guys, some of you were there, you know, you had to have a structure. Okay. So part of the structural issues, I think, are historic, and they have to do with long-seated relationships, but I also think they're legal, and I want to raise this. The structure of this organization is odd, to say the least, for someone who's gone through law school, in that it is, you have an activity that sits inside of a company that is allowed to exist by virtue of its corporate status, which is a non-profit in the United States of America, that has certain rules, requirements, and procedures that have to be followed, including auditing, for instance, including what you do with your employees, including how you treat people across the globe, etc. The IETF rightly wants to be independent and make these decisions themselves, and yet sits inside of an organization that also has to make decisions based on its legal status. That necessarily creates some issues that have to get resolved one way or the other. So I just want to make sure we put that on the table. And then the third piece I just want to say so everybody understands is that I have been in a good dialogue with Yari and Andrew and Alyssa and many others, Gonzalo, our board, over the last year about these very issues. And I want you to know that we are fully committed to being partners with you as you explore all of the various options that might resolve the situation, including, but not limited to, the big funding issue that everybody gets all unnerved about. I actually think these are doable issues. We can work them through. And the important thing is what I think you have all been saying is, what is the organizational structure that's going to allow you to do what it is you do so well? So thank you.
Alyssa Cooper. So I wanted to come back to some of the things that Bob and Lucy raised and try to probe on those a little bit more. In particular, the question about being a volunteer-run or led activity, and I agree with Ecker. I don't think anyone's really talking about making any changes as regards to the technical direction and leadership of the IETF. So if we limit this, just to the admin side, I found it particularly interesting, Lucy, that as the outgoing non-com chair, this notion of the desire to have the administration be done by volunteers as compared to the reality of who is willing to step up and actually volunteer, as Bob pointed out. So I would be interested to understand a little bit better people's thoughts around that, because to me, it seems quite clear that the bulk of the community is not interested in taking on the administrative tasks themselves. And in fact, if we think about the future trajectory of the IETF in terms of, what kinds of participants do we want to be attracting, it's not really obvious to me that your sort of high quality, super good network engineers are going to be the best people to do the administrative tasks, nor will they be interested in doing them. And so I'm wondering a little bit about the gap between kind of the desire to have all of the admin taken up by volunteers versus the reality of the participant base not being terribly well suited to that set of tasks. My other question, going back to you, Lucy, is around, you were talking about the independence from the funding sources, and I was wondering if you could talk about whether you think we are independent from them now.
So I want to make a distinction between a volunteer organization where the volunteers do the administration and volunteers in the broader sense and governance, that self-determination, that I think it's very hard to get people to step up to the housework tasks, but I think people would be very unhappy to lose the ability to influence how the housework tasks are done. And I can give you a very concrete example because I'm a longtime volunteer on the network team, which also has hired hands who do the deploy during meetings and all of that stuff that the volunteers outgrew because we had other responsibilities. But we have the network that we have, and we make the decisions to provision things that we provision, in part because you have a team of volunteers who are still engaged in the technical work and pushing for NAT 6.4 or whatever it is. So you want both of those pieces. You want that self-determination and that driven from what we care about, and then you want helping hands, smart hands, that can help accomplish those tasks. I don't think they're two separate things. The second thing, I would have to think about a clearer answer for you there, but it's vivid in my memory when we were blowing the bolts with the CNRI, that there were people involved in the process of designing the next system who wanted to make sure that we never were in the position again where we had to blow the vaults, where it was a partnership relationship, not an ownership relationship. And I think it's core to hold on to that. And I think now we have a partnership that probably needs some renegotiation.
This mic is difficult for short people, unlike me. Yeah, I think Eric probably captured best my thoughts on the volunteer side of things. Although I really want to, I really appreciate how Lucy's characterizing things, that this is an organization that does want to be able to self-direct and reinvent as necessary. And that's something that we absolutely need to retain. And I would like our terminology not to then have that preclude the possibility of staffing ourselves appropriately, right? I mean, Bob, you only get minutes from the IOC in a reasonable time frame when we have paid people doing it. So let's be clear. And that's not taking away from self-direction and so on. So with that, and focusing on this a little bit, to be a little bit less meta and a little bit more concrete maybe, things that I would like to see going forward include, as I noted in the IASA retrospective document, I would like to know who in this self-directing community is responsible for directing things like our communications plan. Because that isn't an ISG thing. It's not an IAOC thing. I mean, we might review the contracts. Currently kind of falls to the IETF chair, but it means that the list of things that requirements for IETF chair gets super long, and every time we get a new IETF chair that's good at some new thing, the next IETF chair has to be good at that as well. So communications is a fine example. The funding thing, you know, I think that the challenge for the funding thing is to set aside the part that Kathy said we shouldn't be worrying about, understanding how we represent ourselves so that other organizations that should be engaging here, other individuals who should be engaging here, understand what they would get out of it and how to get that out of it, and therefore contribute, you know, time, effort, and money. That's something that I think needs to be a little bit more elaborated in our structure, and support for that needs to be a little bit more elaborated. And that's a fine avenue for us to self-direct ourselves down going forward.
Yeah, I also wanted to talk about the volunteer versus staff issue a little bit. I don't think anybody is suggesting that the volunteers or the IETF community would be out of control here. What I think people are suggesting is that they currently have imperfect tools to affect the entire system, given that this system has sort of grown organically in weird ways, and it's not necessarily optimal for that purpose. So I think we will still see a board that is in charge and is non-com appointed, but they need better tools. They need a better control. And I think Jon also had a very good question of what is the goal here? Not just do a review because some things worked badly, but have a very concrete goal. I think it could actually be the same goal as we had way back, which is IETF be in control of its own administrative destiny. And given that the outgrowth of this complicated system, we're not in as perfect control as we perhaps were before. So let's just do a redesign, and then we have a much cleaner system with volunteers still in control. And yeah, so I mean, if you look at the graph, also the yellow and the blue ones, it's all paid staff. So we're already there in that sense, but we just need the white parts to be in better control. Thank you.
Dave Crocker. So we had this fire hose of issues that was presented to us, and the danger with that is just getting overwhelmed and doing a random walk, finding some way to parcel the details into some compartments that are more organized is going to be really helpful going forward. And another thing that will be helpful is looking for things not to do. In some cases, that's entire tasks, and other things that's limiting the tasks. And so by way of an example, and it's only a mundane one, there was a reference made to people over in ISOC that we don't really manage. We don't hire them. We don't do their performance evaluation and so on. In some cases, it might actually be useful for us to be more involved in some of those people, but in other cases, it probably isn't. By way of example, I'm pretty sure we don't hire or do performance evaluations for AMS staff, and I'm pretty sure that's not a problem for us. And we do. We provide input to them. That's different than saying that we do the performance evaluation. I mean, yes, we provide input, but the relationship is a contractual relationship. In effect, we have hired ISOC to do a collection of things. Some of it is fund development, some of it is administrative tasks. There's even some odd sorts of management-related tasks like the approval mechanism that Kathy cited. What makes that challenging is that ISOC is family. And family businesses are always kind of interesting, especially when we try to change them. The reality of organizational change that I've been taught in any number of different classes is it always produces unexpected effects, and those are almost always bad. That doesn't mean don't do it, but it means be really cautious about it.
Maybe it would help as well with the fire hosing to focus as much, I think, discussion as we can on that question of the target, again, of what it is that people see. And thanks for speaking to that, Dave, of kind of what it is that people see as outcomes of this, outcomes of the process we're engaging in here, where we want to get with this. And Paul.
Paul Hoffman. So I want to clue into something that Leslie said that was, I mean, lots of things people were saying were good, but that struck a chord with me, which is the communications. And I think it has two aspects. One is she's right that if we want to get the outside world more engaged with us, we need to communicate better what we're doing, because let's face it, this is psychedelic to most people, right? Even in organizations that have lots of volunteers, it's like this little box relative to the staff. And I know this because I'm sort of responsible for training people at my organization, ICANN, about the IETF. And you would think, oh, ICANN, IETF, you know, ICANN came out of the IETF. People do not understand this. And it's not just because we have a lot of staff who do some of these things. It's because we interact with lots of other organizations who don't have anything like this at all. Where it comes, the second aspect of that I think would be important is, as you are doing this work, if you're having a hard time thinking of a way to communicate it to the folks in the IETF who are not in this room, who would never be in this room, because that's for somebody else to do. If that's seeming like a hard communication thing, maybe you're doing it too hard. But I think it would be wonderful if, as this process is going on, you're thinking about how will we communicate the result, the process and such, because that will make it easier to describe to the current IETFers who might care a bit about this because they do want the IETF to be here 10 and 20 years from now. And it would certainly help the rest of us. And I really do believe, where Leslie started, which was, if it's easier to describe this, we will get more effective things from the outside world, not just from ICANN, but from a lot of other SDOs and such like that. Thanks.
Ted Hardy. Unlike my colleague behind me, Pete Resnick, who's here for the PTSD workshop for survivors of the original IASA, I'm not that I'm not qualified, I'm just not here for that. I wanted to change what I was up here for to try and respond more directly to the point that you just asked us to, which is, what is our target here? And I think, speaking personally, my target here is an effort to change these interfaces such that the people who are performing the tasks are doing the tasks for which they are actually best suited. And the point that Andrew made about the IEB chair, he and I, with Russ, wrote a draft trying to push this out. But the real thing is we wasted 2 years of his talent. He was one of the best IEB people on the subject of internationalization, on the subject of naming architectures, and we spent his time on something that was incredibly important to a completely different set of concerns than the one that put him on the IEB. I think that what we're trying to do at this point is try and refactor the organization so that after 12 years of change, we put people who are good at the right things into the right jobs again, rather than having the jobs which they're good at imply that they must do things that they are not necessarily good at. That hasn't been good for the organization, and I don't think it's good for us as the individuals performing the tasks. So maybe specialization is for insects. Heinlein once asserted that, but I think in this case, refactoring the organization so that we're able to make selections that reflect the suitability of the actual tasks is the target I would like to get out.
Hi, my name is Pete Resnick. I'm an IASA 2005 survivor.
Hi, Pete.
Thank you. The thing that Dave said struck me as I was standing here, because this started in 2004, 3, whatever, as a problem of family. That is, we had a piece of the family that was running the administrative function, and we had a little family fallout. And it had gone really bad by the time we started, and then we had to sort of pull out of it in this way. We do not want the family relationship with ISOC to get to that point before we fix this. But I've noticed that when Kathy described it, she described it as a strange organization that is an activity of a corporation. And I promise you that not 10 people in IETF think of it that way. I am pretty sure that ISOC thinks of it that way, but there's an awful lot of people here who do not believe we are in any way under ISOC. I think restructuring this such that it is clear that we are a family, but that we have 2 separate organizations that are not in some subservient way is a really good thing. There were models that were proposed at the beginning of this that were much like that. So I have no problem with the idea of having a professional staff to run the part of this, of our work that is not the technical work of the organization. So long as we have some board of people who act as influence to direct more generally, those people being the professional staff, wherever they are housed is fine. But let's be clear on the relationships between the family members here.
Olaf Kolkman, no hats. And basically wanting to share an observation. All the people who have been on the mic line so far were around in 2005. We are talking about the future. Where are the people that are important for the future? So the underlying question, how do we get...
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah, that's right. Yeah. Hopefully they're in working groups doing work, right?
Yeah, but how do we get them involved in this? I think it's important. It's an important thing to consider.
Glendine, a couple of points I'd like to make. Number one, as a global host, separating the names on the checks would actually make the annual conversation that I have to have with my accounting and payments people a lot easier, and it would be more clear. So I'd like to echo that thought. We have a problem that was brought up earlier. We have declining participation at the meetings for a variety of reasons. Part of it's the remote access. Part of it is that there's a shift in the industry, and companies are reducing their participation in many ways. They're still here, but there are fewer people of them. That means that pool of volunteers we have up there, which we are already saying isn't sufficiently meeting the needs we have, is dwindling smaller. So if you get a percentage of people that will volunteer for these administrative tasks out of the overall community, as that community drops, we're going to get fewer people. And so we need to fix that. And I think part of what I'm hearing here is this is bubbling over, and people are trying to make up the gap or saying, we can't make up the gap anymore. We need to do something different. And I think that also comes back to that other problem I just mentioned, which is the number of people here is dwindling. And I think one of the things we're going to need in the future to keep IETF as vibrant as it is to be able to execute very easily on the administrative side, so that when new parties come in and join that community, they onboard really easily and they have a good experience. So they stay and they tell their friends what a good experience they have. So my 2 cents.
Joe Hildebrand. I stood up in reaction to the where are the newbies in this discussion. I don't think I count as that anymore. But yeah, but I do think that this brings up another problem that is sort of tied into that, which is interesting, which is our lack of bench strength for leadership positions that as they come up. And part of that has to do with whether we're able to accept new interesting work, that people are interested in coming and working on it here. And some of that has to do with how people in this room have treated those kinds of communities when they've come in the past. And so I just want to make sure we're all owning our parts of that and continuing to work on them. If there's any part of that that can be tackled in here, I'm not convinced of it, but I just wanted to make sure that, you know, we're not pointing a finger at some people who aren't in the room and they're not in the room because it's our fault.
Alyssa Cooper, I also got up in response to Olaf's comments. Also, I wasn't here in 2005, but I appreciate very much the perspectives of people who were, and that, you know, for a lot of people, this feels like the fun all over again. But that gets to something that I was thinking about anyway when I was sitting there. Wanted to kind of build on top of Ted's, I think, very well articulated response to the question of what is the target, with a couple of other principles that I've sort of heard a little bit, or this one is relevant to Olaf's comment, which is that I think most people who participate in the IETF just want this to work. They don't care really what this diagram looks like or who's doing what, but they want, you know, to have effective meetings, effective secretarial support. They want to be able to have the tools that they need to get their work done. But the background of what it all looks like and how it's shaped isn't of great concern to them. And I frankly think that's fine. Like, there's a lot of people here. There's more people than I maybe would have expected. But we should, you know, find ways to get as much input into this process as we can. But if people say, I don't care what you guys do as long as it works, like, okay, I think we can run with that. There's a couple other principles that I feel like I've heard articulated. One is that in the end, the target of this should be to have a structure which is responsive to the community, you know, which is governed and overseen by the community, even if it's not directly run by the community. So I think that's another important one. I think, as Glenn was mentioning, perhaps a third principle is, you know, have this shaped in such a way that we can continue to raise money and continue to attract new participants to the IETF. You know, those are not very specific, but I just feel like those are kind of the things that are coming out in terms of what the target of this should look like. And they're all areas where we could improve upon from where we are now.
Richard Barnes, part of the post-2005 cohort. I'd been sitting to the side looking for the right metaphor to express exactly what I find so baffling about this whole situation, as someone who wasn't there in the initiation, has only kind of dabbled in it over time. And Pete finally gave me the right one, which is this family metaphor. And the thing about families is that lots of relationships tend to be implicit. and rely on long-standing understandings. And maybe I'm weird in that when I like loan money to a family member, I write them a contract. Yeah, right. For those of you who don't know, my wife is an attorney, so we have some special dynamics in the household. I do think that.
You have staff right.
Yeah, I think that kind of there's kind of a good fences making good neighbors approach to this whole process, and I think that's going to be an important aspect to what we're doing here is kind of figuring out what the lines are that we need to draw. What are precisely the needs of the IETF? That the needs. What infrastructure do we need to create this activity in reality? And articulating those really clearly, and in the sort of way you would do if you were doing a rebid of a contract. And I think that's an important step, but I think it's not the entire task here. That's the first step to getting to the end state we want to get to. I think that Yanni was right to ask the question of like, what is the target? What does the right framework look like? And I don't have an answer to that. I think to the degree I do, it would probably align with a lot of the principles that Dr. Cooper brought up. But I do think that the right way to approach this is to kind of think about what the lines are, what the needs are, and then kind of use that as a way to ask what the best way is to fulfill those needs.
Oh yeah, so yes, I was in the IETF in 2005, but I certainly had nothing to do with the IASA. Which I didn't know I would regret, honestly. But so there's one key point I'd like to make here. In the IETF, we have lots of ways of growing people to understand how to take the technical managerial duties, right? To be on the IESG-RAB, we talk about growing talent, we have shepherds, we have secretaries, we have working group chairs, we teach them things, we do apprenticeship and mentoring, and we have absolutely none of that for anything like the IAOC. And so we cannot complain about the lack of talent when what we're saying is come jump in the deep end of the pool with no training. And it's not, yes, a lot of the community is engineering, but a lot of the community is also senior engineers who are doing management in their companies. I would like to see us think a bit about how we grow the expertise for the oversight and have people be able to gain experience so that they're willing to start taking on the harder tasks. If we don't nurture and mentor, it's not going to happen. And it's not their fault. It's an organizational issue. The second one is, I guess I also share the concerns, of course, about growth of the IETF, outreach issues, increasing participation, spreading into being open to different organizations. But I also look at the need to look at IASA 2.0 and the relationships as part of the outgrowth of the aging of the communities where we've been dependent upon relationships and the people who are there know how it's supposed to work. And over the years, that knowledge is atrophying because people are retiring and changing roles, and that's going to continue. So I'm happy to see this happen. Thank you.
Right.
Ray Pelletier, I am the IAD. Help. I'm going to end with help, but let me say a few things. And I could talk for hours, but I'm going to limit this. One is the trust. There's not enough bandwidth on the IOC members to also be the trustees. And I think it's time for the NOMCOM or some other mechanism to appoint the trustees. And so we'll create a little more time for folks to be experts in those areas. Used to be the IOC chair was also the trust chair. And I said, please, let's have two. One, the trust chair might become the IOC chair. Secondly, the trust chair could focus on the things the trust needed and give me lists of things, because I just can't watch everything. And hoping that would work, and that frankly, that didn't pan out the way I hoped it would. The IOC makeup is such that we have so many ex officio members and an appointee from the ISOC board, such that we only have 2 or 3 folks that could be the chairs. And the result of that is, and we always add 2 new members or 1 or 2 new members every time. This time we have 3 new members, for example. And so consequently, the person who's in their 2nd year or their 3rd year becomes the chair. And it's not because they step forward, it's because everybody stepped back. Okay, so that's good people, well-intentioned anyway, but nonetheless. Mission critical support. We're responsible for affecting the over $1 million, probably $1.5 million worth of tools development over these last 10 years. We're responsible for Meet Echo developing over these last 5-6 years and the support structure that it's become, and it's become a very effective support structure. Mission critical support items. Administrative. We're not monkeying around with standards development work. I mean, that's one of the principles of having this thing set up, was that we wouldn't interfere with that. And I think that we've done a pretty darn good job of interfering with that. Sometimes we step on cultural things. Sometimes but in any event, that's why we have culture members on the boards and on the committees to help keep staff and others in the bowling alley lane, right? So we don't get in the gutters. It doesn't always work. Sometimes I make a decision in a stream of other decisions, and it turns out to be a bad decision. I'm sure we'll hear about it at the plenary time for one of them. But in any event, so mission critical support, paid staff. If you want to get it done, you got to get it done. We're here to support you, figure out what you need. Part of the problem is, every time I ask the ISG, every year, what do you need? And I'm not getting back the feedback that, what administrative support, what kind of things can we do for you that will make your job easier? Okay, let's see now. Can't even read my writing. Oh, okay. Organizational structure. So ISOC, IETF, organized activity of ISOC. I was the executive director of another organization that started out as a committee in a chamber. And just like you've heard from sponsors here now, folks then, I don't want to give to the chamber. I'm not sure it's going to help the high-tech council. I'm not sure it's going to help them. And there was a lot of confusion about that. And over a period of time, we wound up doing was divorcing. And the high-tech council became the Northern Virginia Technology Council, separate organization, a legal structure, incorporated, blah, blah, blah. And what result? More money, more participation, more activities, because they were focused on the things that they wanted to get focused on. They weren't sidetracked. The last part was help. I believe in the mission of this organization, and I don't mind dying on the job. I don't want to die from the job, okay? So help. I mean, really, it's 12 years, and it's getting pretty near the end.
Thank you, Ray. Dave?
Dave Crocker. So I want to try something. Who in the room has been coming to the IETF for 10 years or more? Look around. Okay, thank you. Now, this is the hard one. Who in the room has been coming to the IETF for 3 years or less? Raise it high, please, because we need to see this. So there are people who are showing up for this sort of thing who are relatively new to the IETF, and it's not a large number. Now, we know this, but we don't tend to pay attention to it. Oh. Let's try. We always have to redo surveys. So let's try this again. Not paid staff from ISOC, people who are here for IETF business who would be counted in normal parlance here as volunteers. 3 years or less. Okay, thank you. Thank you a lot. The concern that Bob Hinden raised is one that we need to, I think, pay quite a lot of attention to. And a concern, and that is maintaining the culture, which is a volunteer-based culture. And for the things that we can delegate to staff, that's fine, but we need to be careful that in the process we don't delegate the culture. And that's not a matter of staff being bad or bad intentioned. It's a nature of how we keep control over our own culture. There's things that we can and should delegate to staff that we don't because we're effing engineers and we like all the detail and it's so much more fun than working at a higher level. We need more discipline in how we do our part of this, and we're not very good at that.
We are getting down to it now. So.
Yes, I had noticed that. So I guess I'm hearing a lot of people saying a lot of the same things. And so I was starting to get the impression that actually we do have a fair amount of consensus on general broad direction. And Gonzalo may have other things to say, but I was hoping that maybe we could close out by figuring out what the next steps are in moving in that direction, which I think we kind of all agree on.
Thanks.
I could, you're right. I'll just tell you what to do.
Gonzalo Camarillo. Yeah, actually, I was going to say something along those lines, but first a couple of comments actually from different points of view. Regarding the target, I think the target should be separation of concerns. I don't think thinking, as Pete mentioned before, in terms of who is on top, and it's actually useful. It's just like the ISOC, the Internet Society, is concerned with certain things, IETF is concerned with certain others, and now they are mixed and it's confusing. So I can tell you from an ISOC board perspective, we are really interested in clarifying this. Because as Dave said, we are family, but you know, the ISAC board even is not all IETF people. We have a really hard time explaining all this to the rest of the board. So in that sense, you know, the more clarity we have there, the easier for us is actually to help the IETF and also to accomplish, you know, other parts of the ISOC mission. Also for your information, we are running these future of ISOC discussions right now at the board level. So this is also interesting for us to have clarity and understand how it's, you know, the best way we can support the IETF. So that's from an ISAC perspective. From a global host perspective as well, I fully agree with all the other global hosts, obviously. It's clear that, you know, it's easier to basically put money, in my case, for example, the money that goes to these type of things, it should come from my budget. Money that goes to other ISOC activities should come from the CSR budget. In this case, everything is coming from my budget because everything is tangled up. That's not optimal. In that sense, maybe because I'm an IETFer, I understand this and I can explain it back there. Other organizations, they don't have that luxury. Lastly, I agree we have to restructure all this, but don't think that a new restructure will solve everything. We have operational issues and we have incentive issues. So the new structure, fine, but we have to work on that. Let me give you an example. You know, some people ask me why Ericsson is putting money on that. For them, the incentive is really not there because they said, if you don't put this money, ISOC will put it. So why would you go ahead and put the money? So there's certain incentives that they are not really aligned with what we want to do. And so think of that, you know, structure, operations, and also incentives. And lastly, as Eker said, I mean, let's try to wrap up with a bit of structure so we are clear on next steps. Thank you.
Randy, and then I think we will close the mic lines.
Randy Bush, as you can see by my badge, I'm a newcomer. In 2005, while you were making this mess, I wrote a paper in CCR that said, what's really happening here is as the internet becomes successful, it becomes a vendor game. And it's not evil, it's natural physics. It's who can afford to come and play. And people back home who hold the money don't really see that sending someone here to work on a finance committee meets their goals. Basic Physics 101. Basic Physics 102 is the relationship between the ISOC and the IETF. We pretend it's one thing, but in reality, the ISOC without the IETF doesn't last 3 years. We're the raison d'etre at this point. And I don't want to exert control. We shouldn't, I'm not into that. But all I'm saying is that we need to take more responsibility, we being the IETF, for that list of projects that Olaf put up there. Outreach political, outreach this, building diversity, etc. We're not taking responsibility for those. We don't even know half of them exist until Olaf puts up 100 bullet points.
Alyssa, it would be great, I think, if you have any, not to put you on the spot, if you have any thoughts about how to frame the closing here.
So I thought this was a really excellent discussion, and I appreciate everybody who is in the room, however long you've been participating in the IETF, for being frank and thinking really hard through this this problem. I agree with people at the end who said, you know, it sounds like I heard a lot of sort of the same things over and over from people. It sounds like a lot of people are roughly aligned in terms of you know, the framing questions at the beginning. In particular, this question about, you know, whether there is, you know, do we think there's problems here, and whether people are open to considering, you know, significant changes. It sounds like there is that openness, at least right now. And that includes, you know, we had, depending on how you count, 4 out of 5 or 3 out of 4 of the global hosts mentioned that as well, which I think is significant. So that's really helpful, I think, in terms of shaping what the next steps are. I think also Yanni's question, that's to me is like, if we can continue to sort of beat that around on the mailing list, I'm happy to sort of try to summarize a version of that is the synthesis of this discussion, and use that as the straw man for people to comment on. I think that would be helpful in shaping the future direction of this. And as we do that, we can also kind of start to think of like, what is the shape of some potential solutions here, and start discussing those on the list as well. And my sort of thinking about this is that we continue to run this in the workshop-y kind of style. I thought the workshops were helpful. I think we're not really at the place of like writing a working group chart or anything. But if we can keep the momentum going on the list, probably schedule some more workshops when we have some more meat on the bones in terms of what we're talking about, and you know, some concrete proposals both for the answer to what is the target and what do some of the solutions look like. That's the way that I would propose that we do this, and I feel, you know, in terms of driving this, basically comes back to me. But I will be reaching out to many of you who participated today and who have been participating to help shape that and shape the straw men for further comment. So any quick comments on the sort of process approach here? Does that seem reasonable? Does anyone object to that, the workshop-y kind of process for now?
So I guess, Sean Turner, like, do you feel like what happened today is going to help you frame the question so that we can move forward quickly as opposed to slowly?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, I think this went about as well, and you know, provided as much insight as anybody could have expected. So, thanks.
Randy, last word.
Randy, again, just want to thank you for being considerate of time zones in the workshop.
Okay. Yeah,
Thank you.
definitely, always.
Thank you, everyone. Blue sheets, if you did not sign them, come up to the desk. Thank you.